Hi, welcome everyone. We'll get you started in just a few seconds. Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on ecocentric governance for marine ecosystems, advancing coral reef rights. We're very pleased to have Grant Wilson and Lucy Ward with Earth Law Center today to talk to us about the rights of nature for coral reefs. My name is Sarah Carr. I'm the Chief Knowledge Broker for OCTO, Open Communications for the Ocean. OCTO is an NGO that connects ocean professionals to the knowledge and networks they need through our webinar series and our MPA Help, EBM Help, and Ocean Plastic List communities. OCTO also provides custom consulting services. Um, our formal presentation today will be followed by a Q&A. You can submit questions for Grant and Lucy at any time during the presentation. You can submit it through the chat panel as well as through the Q&A. The Q&A is a little bit easier to monitor, but the chat is great if you are interested in getting perspectives from other attendees. You can make things you put in the chat visible to everyone. The chat, you can also provide information that is on the topic to others who are attending the webinar. We just ask that anything you post in the chat be professional and on topic. We're recording today's webinar and that'll be available later today on the Okta Group website under our webinars page. So thank you again, Grant and Lucy. I'll turn things over to you now. We're very excited you are here today to share this work.
Hey, thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Grant Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of Earth Law Center, and I'm going to give you some introduction into the rights of nature, and then we'll hear from Lucy Ward, our Ocean Program Coordinator. So let's dive in. I'm going to share a PowerPoint here. All right, there we go. Today we're going to talk about Earth law and especially the rights of nature as they relate to coral reef ecosystems. We're going to start by giving you a little overview into what Earth law is and what the rights of nature means. Then we're going to talk about a coral reefs toolkit. You can see a picture of there on the right. We're going to talk about some case studies and go into implementation. And then we're actually going to walk through some of the sample legislation that we've developed that is on the Earth Law Center website. I studied these things for years abstractly, and I found it helps so much to actually look at some legislative text to understand how these concepts work in practice. So we'll all do that together. First, about Earth Law Center, we work to give nature a voice and rights in the legal system. We are expert advisors for governments and communities worldwide toward laws to live in harmony with the natural world. I know in this webinar, there are several other rights of nature experts. Earth Law Center is one group in a tapestry of advocates around the world who are putting this movement into place towards giving nature rights and a voice in the legal system, which was one of our main areas of expertise, that top bullet, the rights of nature movement. Humans have rights, corporations have rights. Nature is beginning to have its rights recognized as well across the world. We also have cross-cutting expertise in the space of what we call Earth law or Earth-centered law, sometimes also called ecocentric law as opposed to anthropocentric or human-centered. So we and our allies work on the rights of future generations, human environmental rights, our own human rights to a healthy environment, indigenous legalities, means of giving nature a voice in law, and even a movement to criminalize ecocide. And you can see our course book cover up on the front there. Just a quick announcement, our second edition of the flagship Earth Law course book comes out in February 2026. So if you're interested in this space and have a interest in law, keep an eye out for that. Just to define a couple terms I mentioned, most of our human laws are currently anthropocentric or human-centered. We do have environmental laws that ensure clean air and clean water and processes to review potentially environmentally harmful projects. But most of these laws that we have have a few shortcomings. And one of those is that they are still rooted in our ownership of nature as property or a resource. Many of our laws still consider nature to be merely something to fuel economic paradigms rather than the reality that humans are part of nature and we're inseparable from its health. And what if our laws reflected that? Many environmental laws are also emergency room type laws. They kick in when a species is almost extinct, let's say, an endangered species law comes into play and often does too little, too late. And what ecocentric law does is it understands humans are part of nature, and all of our laws can reflect this. It understands that our laws shouldn't just prevent the collapse of nature, shouldn't just be an emergency room type law, but instead, what if our laws ensured healthy, thriving, interconnected ecosystems of which nature are a part? And what if nature was not even defined as human property anymore, or a thing or a resource, and we began to recognize that nature has intrinsic value beyond its economic utility to humans, and we can treat it that way in our legal system. And this is what ecocentric law is all about. Of course, there's all these different areas of law that we work in already, and my vision is that every area of law that we work in can be reimagined from an ecocentric perspective. So take constitutional law. We have constitutional rights to clean air, clean water, to life. What if nature had those rights as well as they do in Ecuador right now at the constitutional level? There is a vote in Ecuador on the Constitution coming up, and a lot of people fighting to make sure we maintain the rights of nature in their Constitution. Corporate law. This is about corporations and boards of directors and all of these things. What if nature had a voice in corporate law, and there's innovations to give nature its own board seats to make nature a shareholder of companies? We think of family law for things like divorces, wills, and trusts. But there are people who understand nature is a relative. The Lummi Nation in the Pacific Northwest understands that orcas are relatives. They call them people under the sea. And what if we could use family law to recognize that nature can be a relative as well? Or concepts of guardianship for children that is part of family law to create guardianship frameworks where nature is given a voice through guardians that speak on its behalf, and on and on and on. And there is a movement across the world to create new legal structures that are reflective of our interconnection with nature. And I wanted to just make a couple high-level points, highlighting some case studies about, what does this mean in practice? So let's start with Peru, where last year the Marañón River was given legal rights in a landmark court decision where indigenous woman, Kukama woman, you see in the picture there, sued the government for decades of oil spills in this sacred river, the Marañón, which flows into the Amazon. And they argued that their ancestors lived in the river, that they are inseparable from the watershed, and that they have long been the traditional stewards and protectors of this river. And they wanted to be the legal guardians of the river, to give it a voice in practice. And the court agreed with these decisions. Earth Law Center and other groups submitted amicus briefs and participated in the court hearings. And they declared the rights of this river to flow, to be free from pollution, and otherwise ordered the government to clean up oil spills, and committed to creating a guardianship body to speak for the river, with the indigenous Kukama woman to be amongst the legal guardians of this river. Mariluz Kanakiri won a Goldman Prize last year, the highest environmental honor for this work. As just one other example, rights of nature, in addition to supporting traditional guardians, supports ecological justice. Mar Menor is a saltwater lagoon in Spain that was given legal rights through a national law in Spain, as well as guardianship, just like the last example. So it has a voice in government. This law was challenged because certain politicians and others said, nothing in our Constitution says that nature can be given personhood and it can have a voice. Is this legal? We're challenging this. It went all the way up to the highest court in Spain. And what the highest court in Spain said was, you know what, this is, our Constitution doesn't talk about nature's rights like Ecuador's does. But we believe in intergenerational equity. We believe in climate justice. And our current environmental laws are not upholding a healthy climate. They are not solving the climate crisis. And we really believe that one way to solve the ecological challenges that we face is by giving nature rights and speaking on its behalf, because this is going to support human rights as well. And in fact, since this decision came out, going back to the Americas, in their Inter-American Court of Human Rights, they declared through their landmark advisory opinion on climate change strong support for the rights of nature alongside human environmental rights and the rights of future generations as a key part of addressing the climate crisis. Shout out, I think I saw Hugo Echeverria in the waiting room there. He was instrumental in this case, and please be sure to listen to him talk when you can to get all the nuances. But it's going from the national level, constitutional, community-led guardianship, all the way up to the highest courts in the world, are beginning to look at these new frameworks of ecocentric law as essential solutions for the climate crisis, for the biodiversity crisis, and for our need to evolve past human-centered laws towards living in harmony with nature. One more, I think I have two more quick examples. Rights of nature is also a political tool. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, there is a treaty settlement between the Crown Government of New Zealand and the Maori people, where the Maori people want sovereignty over their land. There's a long history of colonial governments taking this away from indigenous peoples. One form of peace building that's been used is with the rights of nature, or more specifically, personhood for ecosystems, where in this case, the Wanganui River was declared to own itself. It is a person under the law through a treaty settlement. And the Maori and the Crown Government are co-guardians of the river. So if you've heard of co-stewardship with indigenous and non-indigenous governments, where they're co-stewards of an ecosystem, you can take that further and say that nature has personhood. And in this case, the Crown Government, the colonizers, and the Maori people, the Wanganui Iwi or tribe, are co-guardians. They represent the river together and give it a voice in law. And now getting a little closer to coral reefs, rights of nature also integrates science into law. There's a couple great articles about this you can read online. But in Panama, the Leatherback Project worked with the national government of Panama and Earth Law Center and others. We're very proud to provide some legal guidance in this process to write a national law on the rights of nature, which passed in Panama in 2022. And one of the interesting things about this is it has really emphasized the importance of science in a rights of nature framework. So just imagine that nature has rights, and we can go into some of what the law says right here. Imagine nature has rights, a right to health, a right to thrive, a right to evolve. How do you enforce these rights? Well, what does it mean for an ecosystem to thrive, to be healthy? You can define all those things through scientific metrics. So you can define what a healthy coral reef ecosystem is. You can define a healthy watershed. And all of a sudden, this science is brought into the legal system through the lens of nature's rights. And in Panama, since this law passed, there's been 5 court decisions on the rights of nature. There's been a follow-up law on sea turtles that includes rights of sea turtle populations and their habitats. So again, this brings in science because it's about the interconnected health of sea turtles and other animals and the habitats in which they live. And Callie Wielenturf and members of the Panamanian government and others have even started to create protected areas with science-based metrics of health, including the Saboga Wildlife Refuge that incorporate rights of nature principles. So it's going all the way down to very specific stewardship plans. Of course, coral are animals, and Earth law and rights of nature, as I mentioned earlier, means we can no longer keep treating animals as just things under the law, as with ecosystems. They have intrinsic value, and they're a way to give them a voice. These are 3 animals, an elephant in the Bronx Zoo named Happy, a late orca named Scalychuctina in Miami, and stingless bees in Peru, where there's all been rights of nature and personhood campaigns for their health. Just last month, the first community in Peru declared the rights of stingless bees in the Peruvian Amazon. And with this, it elevates traditional beekeeping, as well as efforts to protect the Amazon from deforestation. The last thing is rights of nature at the international level is being recognized through the Biodiversity Treaty. The Convention on Biological Diversity has a global biodiversity framework, It's basically a 10-year plan on how to protect and restore biodiversity across the world. And in this document, there is explicit support for the rights of nature, for something called Mother Earth centric actions, which basically includes rights of nature and other ecocentric approaches. There's support for the intrinsic value of nature. And so this is part of a global movement all the way at the highest level to recognize that nature has intrinsic value and we can create new legal frameworks to live in harmony with nature. Earth Law Centers played a humble part in these movements. We helped with the rights of nature law in Panama. We often fight in the courts for the rights of nature. We've helped create board seats for nature, work in international law, and also have our flagship Earth Law coursebook and course. I'll get to the global chart of all the wins in a second. I do want to say this is a global tapestry with hundreds of activists and advocates and lawyers working for these campaigns all across the world. I urge you to see who's working in your space and your regions. We do have a flagship ocean program, and our flagship ocean program, we're going to hear from Lucy in just a moment, includes efforts towards rights of coral reefs, which I won't talk about because Lucy will. Also, an Indigenous Youth Ocean Congress, which will be in New York City during Climate Week in September 2026, supported by the Running Strong Foundation. A lot of this movement is Indigenous-led, including and especially Indigenous youth-led. If you're in North America, there's been a long and sometimes challenging history of rights of nature in this area of the world, and most of the successes, if not all of them, in practice in certain regions have been through Indigenous leaderships, especially of tribal nations and First Nations. We have a campaign on a voice for deep sea species. We believe that the deep sea, including species and ecosystems, should actually have a seat at the International Seabed Authority to give them a voice in international law when it comes to issues such as deep sea mining. They should be allowed to give input, to have a voice, just as with other guardianship bodies, to help influence whether or not these precious unknown ecosystems are subject to deep sea mining. We work in international law, work on rights of species that we've highlighted, and also do ocean education. The last thing I'll show before I turn it over to Lucy is just advancements in the rights of nature are spectacular. This is from the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor. Please check it out. There are hundreds of initiatives happening towards the rights of nature all over the world. I've highlighted a few. In Ecuador alone, there's over 30 major court decisions, many in the Constitutional Court on the rights of nature. Ugo is in the chat is muttering the exact amount because he knows. Maybe he can put it in the chat there. This is a global movement happening in all regions of the world. In South Asia, in India, and Bangladesh, there's rights of nature advancements in Europe and in Spain and in the UK, all over Latin America, in North America, in Oceania at the international level. And all of these different movements happening in these different regions really take on a cultural flavor of wherever they are happening. So, for example, in Latin American communities, they often take on a flavor of Pachamama, Buen Vivir, of indigenous worldviews. In South Asia, sometimes in Hindu cultural areas, they take on a flavor of nature as a deity, the Ganga River being a deity in Hinduism, and how can you treat a deity as mere property under the law? What if it has rights? And so this is a movement that's global, it's happening at the highest level, but it also deeply reflects the cultures and understandings and people in each region where it advances. Oceans have increasingly in the last year or two become an important focal point of this work. I think one day they could catch up to rivers, which has really probably been the most prolific ecosystem. But let's pass it over to Lucy to dive into a little bit. I gave you a high-level overview of this movement, where it comes from, some of the ideas, some of the case studies. What would all this stuff mean for coral reef ecosystems? Lucy, let me pass it over to you, and I'm happy to keep the slides going. Just tell me when to move. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gran. Yeah, a brilliant overview and introduction to the rights of nature space, what it looks like, and yeah, now I'll take a moment to try and delve a little bit more into what it looks and feels like to explore the implementation and advancing of this movement for marine ecosystems. As a program at the Earth Law Centre, we're definitely focusing in on coral reefs as kind of one of these key ecosystems. And the majority of the reason for that is what you see on the screen here. We wrote and released a toolkit on a voice for coral reef species and ecosystems earlier on in the year. That was like a massively collaborative effort. Some of the contributing organizations and individuals you can see listed on the screen here. And I know a few people who contributed to the toolkit are in the webinar too. Big shout out to Mariana, who I think I saw earlier, who, yeah, her contributions are amazing. So yeah, this was like the general rights of nature movement, I think, a really collaborative effort and a whole bunch of different groups coming together to produce something that hopefully is really usable, really implementable, and clear. So yes, we wrote this earlier in the year and we launched it at the UN Oceans Conference in June. And then since then we've been exploring its implementation with partners. So it's a three-part toolkit, as you can see here. The first part focuses on rights of nature laws and what that looks like for coral reef ecosystems and species. And then part two delves into kind of other ecocentric law frameworks. So that's ecocide law, that's guardianship models, that's nature is kin, some of the things that Grant mentioned earlier on in the presentation as well. So it kind of highlights both of those two things, with part one really focusing on what the rights of nature frameworks and concepts look like. And then part three, the big shiny star in my eyes is the model legislation. So really helping to kind of elucidate what this really looks like in practice and giving this really usable, implementable piece of legislation that can be used across jurisdictions. Yeah, to implement a voice and rights for coral reef ecosystems and species in practice. Um, and yeah, it's ready to be used. So if you switch to the next slide, Grant, in application, using this model legislation, using the toolkit, we're aiming for this two-pronged approach, and this is the approach that we kind of have pushed for and we've been aiming for with different partners as we're looking to implement the toolkit. This approach focuses on what I think Grant has kind of elucidated really well in the first part of the presentation, which is that rights of nature in general and ecocentric law, these are tools. They're really useful tools that help us to kind of understand and reframe our relationships with nature and specifically with coral reef ecosystems. But what this looks like in practice and implementation is going to be done on and should be done on a really case by case basis, led by local communities, indigenous communities, people who are living in relationship with these marine ecosystems and who really understand them and understand how to apply the legislation on the ground. So this is the two-pronged approach that we're taking, and the kind of frame for this is these guardianship bodies, which I won't go into too much detail because I know Grant is going to take us through the model legislation in a bit, so we'll have a chance to kind of pull that up, have a look at what it looks like, and then a lot of this will be put into context as well. But yes, this two-pronged approach is super important to the implementation of the model legislation, working on these kind of legislative changes, whether that be a national, a subnational, or maybe in the future even an international level. But having that rooted in kind of this kind of community and indigenous led knowledge. So if you switch to the next one, Grant. So we kind of have two key pilot projects that we're exploring to implement this on the ground, with key partners in different regions. So this first one is with the Mesoamerican Reef region, and we're partnering with a wonderful organization called Healthy Reefs for Healthy People, who you can see pictured on the screen there. Melanie in the middle there is the head of the organization, and who they've all been working in this space for a really long time. And they produce these wonderful coral reef report cards, which has really helped to kind of unify data from across the Mesoamerican Reef region, in a way that, yeah, helps us to view what the Mesoamerican Reef looks like with this kind of bioregional lens. So a lot of that is what inspired the view and the lens we're taking for this pilot project, examining what it could look like to help forward ecocentric protections for this region with a bioregional lens. So we're focusing down on specific key spots where we can work on place-based pilots, and it looks like that's going to be in Quintana Roo in Mexico. And then we also have this eye on what that it looks like to kind of scale and coordinate that, so different protections can kind of arise at the same time, and we can keep this focus on what it looks like for bioregional protections and using the model legislation as a key tool to do this. But as I said, hopefully while being able to focus on this place-based initiative, helping to kind of forward that across all 4 Mesoamerican reef countries in a kind of similar time frame, which is not only Mexico, but also Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. So if anyone works in those regions, I would love to hear from more people. If anyone's in the Healthy Reefs network, I know their network is really, really huge. So yeah, a call for more collaborators on that as it develops. And then flip to the next one, I think. So our other pilot project that we're exploring in a bit more detail is kind of across the globe in West Papua in Indonesia. And so in this case, we are working on a slightly smaller scale, but again, still very much with this view on what it looks like to do really place-based implementation that's informed by our local partners with a view to, okay, how can we help scale this and support that work on a wider level using legislation as a tool? So our key partners are Ecocentric and our Conservancy. So our Conservancy is a group that is based out in West Papua, headed by Julia and Mary Rose Tapalatu. You can see Julia down in the bottom right-hand corner in this picture. They head the organization and they've been doing work out in the area for ages, really wonderful work helping to kind of train the local communities, especially local youth, to kind of monitor, manage, and protect the reef ecosystems. And Ecoforensic are a partner that have been working for a long time in Ecuador. And their focus is to help train what they call para-ecologists to also monitor and kind of channel scientific data of different ecosystems, not just marine, into rights of nature protections and enforcement. And so Ecoforensic are working with us to help provide trainings and support to our conservancy to on this para-ecology model. And para-ecology, it just means ecologists who are kind of from a very specific area and who have local knowledge, helping them collect data in a way that is applicable for peer-reviewed journals and papers, and also can help feed into rights of nature legislation, as I said before. So we're working on this model to explore the current traditional and customary governance system that's in place in this part of West Papua, which in this specific area is referred to as Sasi Laut. And this involves in a myriad of different kind of measures and protections that often involve kind of fishing closures for different species in different areas at different times of the year to allow the reef system to regenerate, but also to allow local communities to engage with that reef system and extract what they need and kind of live in relationship and support their own communities, as well as making sure that the reef remains healthy. So we are exploring what a model can look like to collect enough data from the reef to help support the protection of the reef, but also to help support the codification and wider implementation of this traditional governance system, Sasi Lao, which has been under threat for a kind of swathe of different reasons, increased kind of technological capacity and ability has caused a lot of dynamite fishing in the area, a lot of other kind of types of fishing which isn't so coordinated by the local groups in the area, so that often results in this kind of breaking of Sasi Laut, which is a very it's a customary governance system, so it's not well codified in kind of state or local legislation, and it's very much word of mouth. So in this project, we're hoping to explore what it looks like to use rights of nature as a tool to support this and support the codification of it, but also its implementation, and also just to help kind of train and empower young people to understand what the system looks like and kind of carry forward its practice in the community as well. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Now we've explored those kind of early pilot projects. I'll flag again that if there's anyone who's interested in this project, has any knowledge they'd love to contribute, I'll throw out another call for kind of more supporters or any more interest in that project. But I'll throw it to Grant to explore the model legislation in a little bit more detail. Oh, you're
Brent,
still
you're
muted.
muted. Yes.
It's not a Zoom meeting unless at least one time you talk.
Exactly.
Thanks, Lucy. That was wonderful and really illustrative for how this works in practice. There's a lot of chat going on, so please check out the chat if you're interested. Just for folks who are listening to the recording, we've mentioned that there is a movement in Africa happening in countries such as Nigeria for rights of the River Ethiopia and maybe some ocean applications in the future. South Africa, Uganda, where there's a national law that has reference to rights of nature. Kenya, where I know there's some folks teaching rights of nature concepts, and some other spots as well. So if you're in that region, check it out, and a lot of interest here. So keep chatting away. Thank you. I'm going to share with you our model legislation. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I am going to at least highlight some important parts. So give me 1 second, and I'm going to pull that up for you. So if you want to find our model legislation, I'm going to share my screen with you now. You just go to the Earth Law Center website, and you go to the Coral Reefs page, pretty easy to find. And then you see here, there's 3 parts to our report. The first part is very much rights of nature. The second part is other ecocentric laws besides the rights of nature. So a lot of governments love the rights of nature. A lot of communities love the rights of nature. It makes a lot of sense. There's a simple elegance to it. Nature has rights. Let's build from that premise to restore the environment. Other places, it might not be the right time for the rights of nature. I know there are indigenous legal frameworks that are totally outside of the confluence of rights, which is really a Eurocentric legal concept in many ways. And many indigenous frameworks are more based on relationships and responsibilities than they are rights. There might be other parts of the world where there's a deep history of laws and governance in relationship to certain principles of religion and culture that, again, don't touch on rights. So we like to be respective of a plurality of legal frameworks and cultural understandings of our relationship and nature. And so part 2 of the toolkit explores other frameworks outside of rights that still might have many of the same concepts. For example, you can have guardians for nature that speak for nature in a rights of nature framework, or that can exist in other traditional frameworks as well. So that's part 2, is the non-rights of nature stuff. And at Earth Law Center, our goal is always to advise governments, communities, indigenous partners, whoever, about what approach makes the most sense for their goals. So we take a lot of pride in that. Part 3 here is the model legislation I'll walk through. And it's a rights of nature piece of model legislation. It's very long. This is like a Cadillac of rights of nature laws. So I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing. I think I'll do about 7 or most 10 minutes going through it. But it's very robust and has a lot of best practices. I think if you're just trying to learn about the rights of nature, it's kind of fun to walk through this whole thing when you have time, because as you see, there's drafters notes here. I'll zoom in a little bit that kind of explain different parts if you're writing a law. So, this preamble is optional and should be customized to your own cultural, spiritual, and traditional beliefs and relationships with coral reefs. And those kind of flavor notes are dispersed throughout. Legislative findings, as with any good law, you can have legislative findings and a purpose of the act. The purpose of this model legislation is to establish a process for formally recognizing designated coral reef ecosystems, and we'll get to that term, within a country or jurisdiction as living entities with legal personality and inherent rights. It's to enumerate the rights necessary for the existence, health, and ecological integrity of these coral reef ecosystems, to establish an independent, fill in the blank, council or guardianship body to act as the legal representative and primary advocate, so to give a voice to coral reefs. Where there's rights, there's also responsibilities of governmental entities and the public at large. So this also defines the duties and obligations of government. If coral reefs have rights, there's things that governmental agencies have to do to enforce and implement those rights. It goes into enforcement mechanisms, and then ways we can ensure the government operates in harmony with coral reefs. Now, as I said, this is kind of a Cadillac, if you want to use that analogy, a very robust model law. Before I go into a couple other things, you can make a lot of progress with mechanisms that are not comprehensive legal frameworks. Now, if a national government came to me and said, Grant, we want to go all in on the rights of nature, what should we do? I'd say, well, you should amend your constitution, and then you should create a whole set of new laws implementing the rights of nature for businesses, for people, for zoning laws, for oceans, for rivers. You should have comprehensive legislation, and then you should have regulations to really show what rights of nature means in practice. What are the scientific metrics? What do we expect of people? When we do environmental impact assessments, how do we incorporate the rights of nature? How does everyone get in on this? I would say it should be comprehensive and robust and sophisticated. Not every government's going to do that. And so we meet people where they are. So I want to say, if you're in a jurisdiction that's interested in this, you can start anywhere. You can start with a non-binding resolution saying, we support the rights of coral reefs. And we're going to launch a 12-month task force to explore this idea. And we're going to come back in 12 months with a report and recommendations for legal changes. And we're going to start with a guardianship body to give them a formal voice in government as a procedural right before we even get to these full frameworks. So I just want to say, if you're in a place that wants to dip their toes in, I like the full frameworks. I think it's time to just kind of reimagine our laws, but you can start anywhere. So I'm going to scroll down. I don't think we'll have time to get into all these. I want to mention this designated coral reef ecosystem. Why do we use that term here? We talked a lot about, if you declare the rights of a river, let's say it's the Colorado River where I am, you can be talking about just the water between the embankments. More often, you're talking about an entire watershed that's interconnected with the health of a river. Coral reef ecosystems, they don't have clear boundaries. You can't always say this is one coral reef just by naming it. So we kind of solve this problem by saying basically the area that would have rights is defined geographically. It can even have specific coordinates, and a government can pass this framework law and then declare the rights of certain coral reef ecosystems as they go. So that, you would designate coral reef ecosystems that have rights. I'm going to keep going down here. As you see, there's a lot to look through. We define the specific rights that coral reefs have. Again, this could be a governmental task that you do with community members and governmental leaders. Some of the things that were important to us is the right to their natural habitat, the right to health and ecological integrity. This one's really important because then you can bring in science. What's a healthy coral reef ecosystem? Oh, now we're bringing in the science, and all of a sudden those scientific metrics become very strong through governance and rights-based frameworks. A right to biodiversity, a right to clean water. We all know that clean water and conversely polluted water severely impacts the health of coral reefs. The right to restoration and recovery. This is very important. We're not just talking about limiting pollution. We're talking about healthy coral reefs that are restored to health. And the right to representation and a voice. There are laws right now about human rights to access justice. You can think of the Escazú Agreement and the Aarhus Convention. Coral reefs deserve a voice in government as well, and we go into that. All right. This section begins to go into how you designate coral reef ecosystems as having rights. So in one application of this, you create a national framework law that says coral reefs, we believe in the rights of coral reefs, and then you begin designating specific coral reefs for rights. You could say all coral reefs have rights in the country. That would work. Or you could start with some pilot projects, which we think is more likely. If you start with like one coral reef ecosystem, this just has a process to keep adding after that. So that's enough. You can go back and read it. Let's go down to the coral reef guardianship body. So in who speaks for coral reef ecosystems? Who speaks for rivers? Who speaks for the trees? This is a question that's beginning to be answered through these guardianship bodies that exist for the Atrato River in Colombia, for the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also Mount Taranaki also in Aotearoa, New Zealand, just set up their guardianship body and appointed the members within the last few months. Um, Also, this idea of giving nature board seats in companies is another way where nature's given a voice. And so we can learn from those, but we can also learn from giving children a voice in government. People often ask me, how do you ensure that guardians for nature don't actually act against their best interest? And I often say, well, we have guardians for children, and there's legal standards to ensure they're acting in the best interest of the child. If they're not, a judge would remove that guardian and reappoint them with someone else who might not have a conflict of interest or who can better act in their best interest. So there's ways to do that. You can have one guardian for nature. There's no reason you have to have a body. I think having a diversity of members allows for more viewpoints and perspectives, a multi-stakeholder panel. So that's what we've recommended here, e.g. 7 to 11 members. You can create categories of members. You can say one member shall have a background in science. One member shall have a background in ecological law. One member shall have lived in the ecosystem or alongside the ecosystem in question for 10 years and have a history of stewardship. You can do that, or you can appoint general people. If there's a lot of communities around an ecosystem, as they did in Spain with Mar Menor, you can also say every community around the ecosystem shall have their own appointment process, and there should be a guardian from each community that collectively speaks for the ecosystem. So there's a lot of options there. Here's some ideas if you do want to do the kind of categories approach. And again, these are all just ideas. You can have terms of office, you can have an oath. And then you know grounds for removal if something goes wrong. Um, Competence, you know, everyone there should basically be committed to act in the best interest of the coral reefs. This is not balancing, you know, the interests of people exploiting coral reefs with the coral reefs. This is just strictly giving a voice to the coral reefs, and this is a lot of text to get into that. Maybe we'll do one more section, then open up to questions. This one's important because if coral reefs have rights, we can't just leave it at that. We actually think it's really important to define governmental duties and responsibilities to avoid litigation. I would love to see less litigation on the rights of nature because simply sometimes the rights or the obligations of government are not clearly defined. And so you have to litigate to figure out what's government required to do. If you have a kind of comprehensive scheme that says, you know, the government will review all of the existing laws, policies, and plans for harmonization with the rights of coral reefs. They will integrate coral reef rights and objectives into protection and restoration efforts. The government will cooperate with the guardianship body. And this gets even more deep into environmental law. They will consider the rights of coral reefs in environmental impact assessments or strategic environmental assessments. When you get into all these issues, if you can legislate that, it means there's going to be fewer lawsuits, you know, kind of trying to figure out what this means in practice. Of course, you can still have standing to sue in this law. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more. I encourage you to check it out. We've got 17 minutes. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Okay. Thank you so much, Grant and Lucy. This was fantastic. To see that you created this resource for everyone so that more people can pursue this work. So let's see, we have several questions, but I want to remind everyone you can send in questions through the Q&A or the chat, and you can actually post it in both, and I will not be offended. Okay, question that came up, can Grant or Lucy say anything about overlapping rights and whether this is problematic? I'm thinking specifically of the movement to establish ocean rights and now the emerging rights of designated coral reefs. How can we ensure the rights are aligned? And does the guardianship at the finest scale trump more generalized representation?
I could kick off something and pass it over to you, Lucy, maybe to introduce ocean rights as a concept. You know, you can have broad rights of nature frameworks, and I would actually recommend this. You know, if a country is interested in constitutional rights of nature, that's great. A high-level rights of nature law, that's great. But then I think, you know, forests have forest rights, and rivers have river rights, and coral reefs have coral reef rights, and they're specific. There's a Universal Declaration on the rights of rivers, on the rights of the ocean, on deep sea species, and you know, basically the question you ask is, what does this ecosystem need to have and to do to fulfill its role in the larger community of life? And the answer to that question is different for each ecosystem type. And I think when you get into the specifics of an ecosystem type, you begin to uphold, um, identify ways to protect it that are less generalized and more specific. When you zoom out, of course, maybe sometimes the interests of the coral reef conflict in some ways with other interests, and there are ways to resolve those conflicts. But certainly, I support high-level rights of nature. But I think to get into the second generation of rights of nature laws, with the first being kind of like vague, high-level rights that we've done our best to implement. The next generation is very nuanced, specific, regulatory level rights of nature, and it's going to require more sophistication that considers how different ecosystem types and species function and what they need to thrive. So that's the basic idea, and zooming into different ecosystem types. But Lucy, maybe you can give a comment on the ocean rights movement at large and anything else you'd like to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say briefly that I think, yeah, it echoes what you've said already, Grant, in that like I think that these broader frames of implementation, like the more kind of global ocean rights movement and what that looks like, is only going to be supported by the intricacies that are revealed by these more kind of specific, quite fine scale cases. It seems that, and at least when I've had conversations with folks, especially at kind of in government or looking at policy, who are interested in what it means, I think it becomes more communicable and translatable when there's examples of what this looks like in practice. And the model legislation so far has been a kind of quite a grounding thing for us to help communicate this. And we're working with other partners on a universal declaration of ocean rights, which is being forwarded on at UN level, and that's something that's been in the works through ELC and through the previous head of the Rights Program at ELC, Michelle Bender, and is now ongoing through her work at Ocean Vision Legal, who we're collaborating with on that kind of international movement. So I think there's something to be said for making sure that the kind of the language and the framing is aligned through the global movement, and the work that Michelle and OVL are doing to kind of lead the global ocean rights movement, which now kind of has its own website and its own grounding place, and all the organizations who are working in that space are signing up to the Declaration of Ocean Rights to kind of gather this collective push towards the Universal Declaration that centers language, that centers clear communication and advocacy. And they've released a communications and advocacy toolkit, which we're, adhering to absolutely the best of our ability, and we push others to do the same. So I think there's something important to be said in making sure that it's like there is this global push towards kind of like making sure that language is even, and that's an important thing to think about when putting the kind of finer scale application into context as well.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Um, Question I really want to get to. Do you think there could be rights of nature in the high seas? Do you have any thoughts on how a guardianship body would work in this context, especially to ensure indigenous voices from around the globe are heard?
Definitely. I did right before I start that. I did want to say one place to kind of engage in this harmonization process of different rights of nature frameworks is the IUCN. At their World Conservation Congress just last month, they adopted 5 motions pertaining to the rights of nature. And one of those that we worked on rights of rivers actually talks about working to harmonize rights of rivers and rights of wetlands movements. So I think that's a good place for these conversations as well. There was also an oceans motion there. Yeah, the High Seas Treaty is a very interesting place for this. There's a couple of things to say here. One is that there are areas of the world that nobody owns per se. The high seas being one that's often referenced, the deep sea, Mary Birdland in Antarctica. And those are all interesting places to consider. Well, if no one owns those places, why can't they own themselves? And why can't nature have a voice through international law, through recognition of its own rights in these places, terra nullius land, you can call it, that no one actually owns, and that we're just co-stewarding or co-managing anyway, not unlike the Wanganui River that I mentioned, the Crown government and the Wanganui iwi are co-managing and now co-guardians of. And so just that basic premise, I think, is really interesting in international law. And I think we should be moving towards considering giving nature a voice in the United Nations in international law. And it'd be pretty simple to do that if there's political will for it. With the High Seas Treaty specifically, I think it is an incredible opportunity to consider how do we give nature a voice through the High Seas Treaty, considering what I just mentioned about areas of the world that nobody owns, considering this collective agreement to protect and restore marine biodiversity. And also understanding that marine protected areas are going to be a big part of that treaty. We actually have a whole toolkit on Earth law being integrated through marine protected areas that I think would slide very nicely into the High Seas Treaty. So I think that's a great opportunity. Gail Sarda's on the line here for Earth Law Center and is our international law expert and is literally updating a paper right now about giving nature a voice in international law to reflect new developments in the High Seas Treaty for doing so. So totally think it's a great opportunity. And Lucy, you can add anything, or if that's good, we can keep moving.
Yeah, I'll just really briefly add that the language within the High Seas Treaty, already leans quite nicely into, talking about intrinsic values when you're implementing it. And I think this like kind of cross collaborative effort that we're going to see between different countries in creating these MPAs will hopefully could provide a great framework for doing innovative stuff in the creation of the MPAs, and specifically with the kind of coral reefs lens onto deep sea corals are often quite an overlooked ecosystem, and this could be a great place to campaign for these ecosystems, but also to apply a guardianship body or even this kind of Earth law framework for marine protected areas that Grant already mentioned, and think about how we can use this opportunity to be really innovative as we create laws rather than kind of shift and change, which I think could be really fun.
Okay, thank you. And a follow-on to that, how do you assess the role of the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, the BBNJ Treaty, as a possible framework to enforce the rights of nature on the high seas?
And yeah, that was sort of what I was referring to with the High Seas Treaty. I would say one thing to add to that is that one way that'd be pretty simple to give nature a voice in treaties, including the BBNJ, including the Biodiversity Convention, and others, would be to have some sort of motion or resolution that says any government that has a formal guardianship body that speaks on behalf of nature can send a delegate from that body to participate in an international delegation on behalf of nature. And so you can imagine if this framework were to be adopted, you can imagine countries adopt the rights of coral reefs and they create a guardianship body as they have done with other guardianship bodies. And maybe that country agrees to send a delegate from that guardianship body to speak for nature in international fora. That would be pretty easy to do. I think you could adopt that in the BBNJ, or you could do something else that agrees to some other sort of appointment process. You could even see a world where every country that's a member of the treaty appoints one individual to speak on behalf of nature, and there's a large nature delegation in that sense. But I think with the high seas, it's a perfect opportunity alongside the deep sea, Mary Birdland, and Antarctica generally. And there's a great effort to recognize the rights of Antarctica and give it a voice in international law you can learn about. These are all kind of the low-hanging fruits of how to apply these concepts through international law.
Thank you both. A question, how are you defining ecocide and how is it officially recognized?
Yeah, so there's a formal definition of ecocide that was adopted by an expert panel in 2021. And it was a group of jurists and lawmakers and former judges and stuff. And let's see, I think I have it handy. It's the unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. I can put it in here. And then they go on to define all those terms with greater specificity. And there's you can listen to some great videos by Jojo Mehta and others explaining this. So yeah, it's very clearly defined. Rights of nature has had kind of different definitions in different places according to cultural context. I'd say there's not a universal definition, but ecocide there is, and there's these two movements are often interchanging ideas. If you're at COP30, there's going to be a panel in the blue zone on rights of nature and ecocide. And they're different ideas, but they share similarities in that they're transformative movements that seek to challenge some of the fundamental drivers of the environmental crisis through legal reform. And there's a lot of countries supporting the criminalization of ecocide, both nationally and through the International Criminal Court. So another really cool movement.
Okay. Thank you, Grant. A question that came into the chat. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really informative. As scientists, how can we better support and get involved in governance for the environment?
Lucy, I'm going to just pass this off to you.
Yeah, I can, and I was literally typing an answer to this question in the chat because I was wondering if we'd only take ones from the Q&A box. So I'm glad we picked it up. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I mean, I would say I think scientists are like fantastically placed to do two things, which is first of all, kind of communicate the data that you collect to help support the implementation and enforcement of rights of nature laws. I think it is a gap in the movement at the moment for what does it look like to communicate the science well to support this growing movement and really link those two things together, not just in practice but publicly as well in our wider communication. But also more specifically as well, it's like how do we design this data collection to really feed into this implementation? What does it look like to help define what makes a healthy reef ecosystem, and how do we do that for specific bioregions, and how do we then help translate that to kind of lobby government to create these changes by kind of giving that helping hand in like this is how we would do it, this is why we would do it, here's the baseline data, this is what we're aiming for, we can prove that the reef isn't healthy right now because of XYZ reasons, and then providing data over time to say, like, for example, this is why we need rights of nature protections, let's implement one. And then after the fact also being able to say, hey, look, because we had this awesome baseline data that we knew we were going to have to apply to this swathe of rights and this specific language, now we can show this kind of statistical significance from A to B, pre and post legislation. I think that's something that we maybe haven't been able to do super well yet in the movement, and I'm really excited to be able to explore, and hopefully even with the coral reefs legislation as well, like we can really get into the language and provide that kind of train all the way through. And I think scientists are just like perfectly placed to design this work, but also to help communicate it. And I think Callie, who Grant mentioned earlier in our presentation, Callie Wielenturf of the Leather Project, who is a National Geographic explorer and was instrumental in Law 287 in Panama and the National Rights of Nature Law in Panama. Her communication skills, her work with Indigenous communities, and her ability to use her kind of scientific expertise to help lobby the government was instrumental in that. And I think it's a model that can definitely be replicated elsewhere as well.
Okay, thank you. I see Grant is typing an answer to one of the questions, so I'll go to one that isn't yet being answered. Okay, how can we proceed with a strategy for offense rather than defense regarding rights of nature to preempt extractive industries from mining and fossil fuels encroaching on pristine environments?
Yeah, so I think, rights of nature in many ways is all about shifting from a reactive approach where you try to stop environmental challenges before they become too late to more of an offensive approach. And I'm going to send my answer to another question in the meantime. So I think that's very much core to the rights of nature. How do you do it? I think you can still use a lot of traditional legal mechanisms to do that. One very basic one is to require consideration of the rights of nature in environmental impact assessments. There's a case in Ecuador on Los Cedros cloud forest where its rights were upheld in a landmark constitutional court case. And one of the things they said is that before all these mining permits were issued, that the proponents of mining should have considered rights of nature in the earliest stage of their project development. So that's just an example where instead of like, oh, this species is about to go extinct, let's launch a lawsuit and try to delay or cause public opposition, or most of the time environmental laws just delay until politics change or people run out of money. Instead of that, it's considering nature's interconnected health at the very earliest stage of a project. And there are some traditional legal tools that can incorporate rights of nature to do that.
Okay. Thank you, Grant. And thank you Thank you both. Thank you, Grant and Lucy, for the fantastic presentation. We're out of time now. We got to just about all the questions. And for the questions that we didn't get to, I'll make those available to you after. Thank you also to all of our attendees and really, really our participants, because this was a great chat with a tremendous amount of information shared, and we appreciate everyone weighing in to share their expertise. So thank you again for teaching us about this and for doing this work in the first place. And we look forward to hearing about future work and progress in this realm in future webinars. Thank you again, Lucy and Grant.
Hey, thank you. That was really fun. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, and thank you, everyone. We'll catch you on a future webinar. Okay, bye.